welcome to another episode of Disastrous History. This week, we're going back to our roots and we're going to talk about a fire, one of the most infamous fires in history. This week, we're going to talk about the Cocoanut Grove fire in November of 1942 in Boston, Massachusetts. The best place to start this episode is with what the Cocoanut Grove was. Originally built in 1916, the building at 17 Piedmont Street in Boston's Bay Village was built as a reinforced concrete structure. It originally opened as a garage and then was a couple other things over the years, including a storage facility for Paramount Pictures, before changing occupancy in 1927. On October 27, 1927, the Cocoanut Grove officially opened as a nightclub. Owned by the leaders of the Cocoanut Grove Orchestra, Mickey Alpert and Jacques Renard, they made a decent amount of money in the first couple years, but quickly began to lose money due to many things. Turns out, nightclubs in the midst of Prohibition aren't exactly super profitable. But the Boston Mafia soon became quite entangled in the middle of the nightclub, and it turned into a speakeasy. Because again, a nightclub with no alcohol sounds like a nightmare. If you're unaware what a speakeasy is, it is an establishment of some sort in the United States during Prohibition that sold alcohol illegally. Prohibition was when the sale of alcohol was outlawed nationwide from 1920 to 1933. If you remember back to the very beginning of my podcast, the Boston Molasses episode, we talked about Prohibition in detail. And honestly, Prohibition was an incredibly unpopular decision and gave rise to moonshining and secret bars everywhere, and oddly enough, NASCAR, because bootleggers would soup up their cars to run from the cops and then decided, hey, what if we raced each other in these super fast cars? Because of course they did. Because obviously when your buddy gets the super fast car and then you get a super fast car, the first thing you're going to say is, hey, I bet my car is faster than yours. And then all of a sudden, all of you are racing around a track at 200 miles an hour. Super fun. I secretly love NASCAR. Anyway, when Alpert and Renard put the Grove up for sale in 1931 after they had lost a lot of money, it was bought by a man by the name of Charles Solomon. His nickname was King, Charles King Solomon. And of course, he was a mob boss. Because his nickname was King, everyone with the nickname King, unless you're Richard Petty or Elvis, or Michael Jackson, I guess, is a mob boss. But he's not just any mob boss. He was the mob boss for Boston at the time. In the early 20s, he was in charge of all narcotics trafficking in Boston. By the time he bought the Cocoanut Grove in 1931, he had greatly expanded into speakeasies throughout the city and was at the top of his game. But when you're at the top, especially the top of the mob, everyone is gunning for you. More often than not, literally gunning for you. In early January 1933, Solomon was arrested for conspiracy to smuggle alcohol. At that time, he was warned to, and this is a direct quote, accept no bail, keep out of the sun and the glare of electric lights. That was told to him by someone that arrested him. Solomon was said to have laughed at the warning, immediately posted bail, and headed out on the town to party. On January 23, 1933, he went to the Cocoanut Grove that he owned at around 1 a.m., loaded his pockets up with a reported amount of about $4,600, equivalent to $109,000 today, and headed out to a party at the Cotton Club in Boston. Sometime later, Solomon was shot 3 times in the bathroom of the Cotton Club. He managed to stumble out of the bathroom and collapse in front of several bystanders. He was rushed to the hospital, where he died a few hours later, reportedly cursing those dirty rats who killed him, because he's a mob boss. Of course, when you're dying of gunshot wounds, you're going to curse those dirty rats. He was most likely murdered to keep him from even potentially testifying against anyone else in the case coming up. There was some concern that he was going to testify against others in this upcoming smuggling case in an attempt to save his own skin. So they did what the mafia does, and they got rid of him. And just an interesting note before we move on past Charles Solomon here, there was actually a fire in the Cocoanut Grove before the fire we're going to talk about today. It was on November 2nd, 1931, and it was incredibly small. Literally no losses were recorded from this fire, so it was nothing. But I just thought it was interesting to include that it was not technically the first fire in the Cocoanut Grove. But anyway, once Charles Solomon met his unfortunate end, Cocoanut Grove passed on to his lawyer, Barnett Wilansky. Conveniently for Wolanski, Prohibition ended in December of 1933, so he was able to drop all pretense and start selling alcohol as an actual bar and restaurant. Around 1941, Wolanski brought in an interior designer, Reuben Bordenhorn, who went all in on making the Cocoanut Grove really live up to its name. He brought in blue satin cloth for the ceilings and walls, paper palm trees, a rolling stage, and a retractable roof that could be opened when it was a warm and clear night. Now, this is where I'm going to take some time to explain the interior of this building for two reasons. Number one, it's incredibly important because it speaks to why and how this fire grew the way it did, and how and why the disaster played out the way it did. And number two, because the building was kind of a nightmare Frankenstein of a bunch of buildings smashed together, so we really need to get an understanding because there's going to be a lot of discussion of these people traveled this way and the fire traveled this way and all of that. So we really need to get a nice, solid layout of this building before we get into the actual fire itself. So, the best place to start is obviously the entrance. The original entrance had the address of 17 Piedmont Street. This was considered to be the front of the building. On the very front of it were 3 arched openings leading to a portico. The portico was 9 feet deep and about 18 feet across. So it was kind of the actual entrance to the club was recessed back into the building a bit, and there were 3 arched openings that you could walk through any 3 of them. There weren't any doors or anything, and then there was kind of like almost like a porch area before you got to a revolving door. The center arch into the portico was approximately 4 feet across. This was directly in front of the patron entrance, and the patron entrance here was a revolving door. On either side of this center opening were 2 arched openings that were approximately 5 feet across, give or take. Immediately to the left of the revolving door, back in this porch area, was a man door. But this was not accessible by patrons. This was to access the check room and an office. Immediately to the right of the revolving door was a solid wall. Nothing there. Outside the portico, to the right, was a window that led to a service area, and then a basement window that led to a storage area down in the basement. When you walked through the revolving door, you were met with a foyer just inside the building. This was a fairly large foyer. Across from you to the right was the entrance to the main dining area. Across from you on the left were the men's and women's restrooms as well as a coat check. Further to the left and around a corner was a stairwell downstairs to a lounge area that we will talk about in a minute. At the top of this stairwell was a doorway to the exterior with Panic Hardware and an exit sign. So this was further down Piedmont Street away from the entrance. So this particular doorway to the outside was nowhere near the revolving door. We're talking 30, 40 feet away. On your right, immediately after you walk in the foyer, was a step up into the caricature bar, which was a long bar that we'll talk about in a minute. The foyer was decorated with upholstered chairs and couches arranged along the wall for people in the club to relax on. So basically, when you walked into this club, you were immediately met with luxury. You have all these upholstered chairs, people all looking nice in all their outfits that they went out to the club in. You can see the main dining area off to your right where you have, your dance floor. You have all these tables. You have the orchestras going on in there. So it's inviting you in, and it's this big open foyer area where everybody's just kind of milling out and hanging out as they try and figure out where exactly in the club you want to go. And you can get to 3 out of the 4 main areas in the club from this particular foyer as long as you know where to go, and it's inviting you in all different directions. So moving out of the foyer, we're going to travel to the right into the caricature bar. This was a room that had a 48-foot long bar that was said to be the longest continuous bar in Boston. Now, the caricature bar was famous because drawings of the famous individuals who came to visit the bar, of which there were many, were up on the walls, hence the name, the caricature bar. They were drawings that were caricatures of all the famous people. The Grove was one of the most popular nightclubs in the entire city, so whenever celebrities came to town, they almost always purposefully visited the Grove. Now, obviously, the main draw of this room was the super long 48-foot bar. This was the main place that people got drinks. This was on, if you're walking up the stairs after coming in from the foyer, this was on the left. On the right, along the wall, was a smaller service bar. Behind this service bar were 4 casement windows leading out to Piedmont Street, but all 4 windows were covered with thick blackout curtains to give the bar a kind of cozy feeling, almost a romantic feeling, and give you that nightclub feel. It was a nightclub after all. At the opposite end of the bar from the foyer was a short passageway that led into the brand new lounge, the Broadway Lounge. Along the same wall as the caricature bar was an entrance to the main dining room. So the caricature bar kind of jutted out through the middle of this room, and then on the left side of the bar, if you're walking in from the foyer, was an entrance into the main dining room. On the right was a service bar. All the way at the other end was a walkway leading to the new lounge area, the Broadway Lounge. So, entering the main dining room from the caricature bar opened to a wide open dining area. The caricature bar and the main dining area were only separated by a partial wall, but there was a step up from the dance floor area. Directly in the center of the room was the dance floor. Over the dance floor was a retractable roof that could be opened during the summertime for a nice view of the stars, because what better way to draw people to your nightclub is to be able in the summer when everybody's out there dancing, having a grand old time, that you can open the roof and you can see the stars as you're dancing with your date or sitting at a table with your date. That is absolutely romantic and makes sense why Coconut Grove became so popular. All around the exterior of the dance floor were tables and chairs for guests to sit while they rested from dancing or ate dinner or had their drinks and flirted with their dates. On the opposite side of the caricature bar, so you walk out of the caricature bar into the main dining floor, the opposite side of that was a raised seating area that sat about 6 inches above the main floor level that was covered by an awning with special Spanish tile. So basically, it was like a patio, but indoors. So that there was like a roof that stuck out indoors that had Spanish tile on it that made it look like it was, a fancy outdoor bar down somewhere in the Caribbean or, down south on the beach, something like that. This side of the main dining room exited onto Shawmut Street and had a door in the center of the wall, technically. The exterior door was covered by Venetian folding wooden doors that had to be opened to then access the door to the outside. So Venetian doors are those ones that fold like I don't know, those closet doors that fold out. You have to like slide them across. You had to open 2 of those. One slid to the right, one slid to the left. On either side of this exit door were 2 large storefront windows. However, inside the clubs, these windows were not visible as a false wall had been put up on either side that completely obscured their existence. On the far left end of this wall was a service stairwell down into the kitchen in the basement. Along the wall, so if you're walking out of the caricature bar, the wall along the left was the terrace. The terrace was a VIP type area that sat about 2 or 3 feet off of floor level, so you had to walk up a couple steps to get up there. It was surrounded by an iron fencing and measured about 32 feet wide by 12 feet deep. On the opposite end of the terrace, so when you're walking out of the caricature bar, if you look to your right, there was the orchestra stage that sat about 4 feet off the ground level. The walls and ceiling of the orchestra stage area were covered with fabric. The entire main dining area was decorated with 6 paper palm trees that had coconuts with the lighting inside, and the ceiling was covered with fabric. Located behind the orchestra area was the dressing room and a telephone room. The main dining area was a huge draw for the Coconut Grove. The orchestra was fantastic. It was still run by the original club owner, Mickey Alpert, and they would have, floor shows and they would have dancing and all of that. It was a huge deal, especially the retractable roof, because that's a novelty. So that's going to draw people in. It was supposed to seat about 400 or so people, give or take, but it very, very often went well past that 400 person limit. So then traveling further into the nightclub, back on the right, so if you're coming out the caricature bar to your right, and in the actual main dining room, there was a separate entrance into a passageway into the Broadway Lounge. Now, these were 2 separate entrances. There was an entrance to this passageway inside the actual caricature bar, and then there was a separate entrance that was distinct. It wasn't just one big opening. It was 2 separate doorways that went into this passageway that led to a hallway that led into the Broadway Lounge. So you had basically, it was like a merge. You had 2 merge lanes that merged into one going into this new lounge. The Broadway Lounge had opened on November 21st, 1942. What's important to note here is this was a completely separate building that had been smashed into the original building and kind of Frankensteined together. Entering the Broadway lounge from the main dining room showed a bar on the right side and then a men's room and a women's room on the left side. So again, on your right, you have a bar. All the way on the other side of the room on your left, you have a men's room and a women's room and a coat check in that area. This room was full of tables and chairs and all of that. On the upper left side of the Broadway lounge was a door that led to a vestibule that exited the building. On that same wall, so on the opposite side of where you're entering from, were two separate windows that were made of glass blocks. And this is just the first floor. There was also a second and third floor that held a dressing room and some storage up there that we're not really going to talk about it, but it's important to know it existed. Several people would eventually escape out that way, but it didn't really get involved in this particular instance. So, moving all the way back to the foyer area, there was a stairwell I briefly talked about. This stairwell led down to the Melody Lounge. Now, if you're coming back all the way to the entrance with me, you're walking through the revolving door, you're turning immediately to your left, and you are walking as far as you can go until you hit a wall. And then you're turning to your left and walking as far as you can go, which is only a few feet. And then turning to your left, there is a stairwell there that leads downstairs to the Melody Lounge. The Melody Lounge was yet another bar area, nightclub. There's going to be lots of bars. It was a circular bar located in the center of the room with bar stools all the way around. Then there were tables and chairs filling in all the other areas around that circular bar in the center of the room. The ceiling down here was covered with blue satin cloth, just like upstairs. But this one was slightly different than the upstairs one. That one was actually up against the ceiling. This one was hung from the ceiling about 16 inches down on wooden strips. So there was a void space between where this cloth was and then where the actual ceiling was in the basement. This gave it more of a cozy feeling. So upstairs, you've got these really high ceilings. If you drop it down 16 inches, it makes it feel more cozy, makes it feel more romantic. It makes it a little bit more dark. The light isn't traveling nearly as far. It kind of muffles noises a little bit down there, so it gave it more of a place that you could bring your date and you could, get all cozy and whatnot. The lighting was lower here. It was significantly more romantic. The lighting in this area was almost exclusively via small light bulbs that were hidden in coconuts on approximately 5 or 6 artificial paper palm trees for ambiance. It was a perfectly dark area to make it feel closer and more intimate for those guests on dates. There were technically 2 exits from this room. One was the stairs down from the main floor from the foyer. This is the only one the patrons technically knew about. The other was a doorway into a hallway that led to the kitchen on the other side of the basement. This was a secret door that matched the wood paneling of the Melody Lounge wall, so patrons wouldn't know where it was and waiters could slip in and out with relative anonymity without breaking the mystique of the room. Through that secret door was a passageway. On the left side of that passageway was a door to an alley outside. Also in this area were several compressors that assisted in the cooling of the building. On the right side, an inward swinging door that led into the kitchen, which was a maze of different rooms consisting of storage rooms, refrigerators, and the heating room for the nightclub. So, the Melody Lounge is incredibly important. You come down the stairs and you turn to your left, and the first thing you see is that big circular bar in the center of the room. All the way around were just tables and chairs all the way around. There were bar stools around the bar, and then tables and chairs all the way around that. And they were nestled in all of the areas. Now, the occupancy for this area was approximately 100 or so people, but it very, very frequently went past this. And it frequently got very busy down there with lots of people on dates. So that's the general layout of the building. It was a conglomeration of rooms added onto rooms with decorations and chairs and tables everywhere. Every room had fabric on the ceiling. The Melody Lounge in particular had cotton-backed satin fabric that was sold as fireproof. It was installed sometime in 1940. Now, because this was 1940, everything was sold as fireproof, and to their credit, they did test if it was actually fireproof, kind of. By installing it on the ceiling, then various people would come in and hold a match to it and see if it ignited, which I guess technically if it doesn't ignite, you could say that it was fireproof. Depositions taken with the man who supplied the fabric, Joseph Dobesh, stated that the numerous individuals who inspected the fabric at the time of installation held matches to the fabric to see if it would ignite, and it didn't. So, what more could you really want from him? He did state in his depositions that the fabric was supposed to be resprayed with ammonia sulfate at least once a year to maintain the fireproofing. The problem was, there's absolutely zero evidence this was actually done after installation of the fabric, which technically is not on him, but that is a thing. The same goes for the fake palm trees upstairs in the main dining area and in the Melody Lounge. The man who installed them, the interior designer Reuben Bordenhorn, literally lit a match and held it to the palm trees until he was convinced it wouldn't ignite. That is your fireproof evidence. That is all you're going to get. But they were supposed to be re-fireproofed every 6 months. But again, there is no evidence that the palm trees were ever sprayed with fireproofing material after they were initially installed. And then there's one last thing before we get into the actual story of the fire. We need to talk about fire safety in the building, which, as you can tell from early on in this episode and going through the building itself, there's very little of it. But there's even less than you know. In quite the twist, the Cocoanut Grove was inspected by Boston Fire Inspector Lieutenant Frank Linney 8 days before the fire. And honestly, I'm just going to read the entire report to you because it really isn't that long. It is 124 words. The report reads as follows. Building. 1 story. Occupies approximately 7,500 square feet. I submit the following report of inspection made this day, November 20th, 1942, and in my opinion, condition of the premises is good. A new addition has been added on the Broadway side, used as a cocktail lounge room, seating 100 people. No inflammable decoration. Main dining room seating 400 people. Old tenement houses next to new lounge room. Second floor used as a dressing room. Third floor used as help locker room. This building connects into hallway between lounge and main dining room. Kitchen and basement, free from grease, hood over stove, underside clean. Cocktail bar. Sufficient number of exits, sufficient number of extinguishers, heat using fuel oil, 2 275-gallon tanks, and coal. Condition, good. And that is no joke. That is the end of his fire inspection of the Cocoanut Grove. 8 days before the fire. My favorite, and I just want to break it down real quick. One thing that jumps out at me is the kitchen and basement free from grease, hood over stove, underside clean. And then the next sentence just says cocktail bar. That is one whole sentence. Cocktail bar. Cocktail bar, period. Okay, which one? Because he talked about the main dining room. He talked about the cocktail lounge room upstairs, the new Broadway lounge. But is he talking about the caricature bar? Is he talking about the Melody Lounge? Is he talking about the bar in the main dining room? What is he talking about? What about it? There's no description of it. It literally just says cocktail bar. Is it the entire club? Because the next thing he says is sufficient number of exits. And then he says sufficient number of extinguishers. And I don't want to get ahead of myself, but there's not sufficient number of extinguishers in this place. Spoiler alert. But we're going to get to that. Anyway, let's analyze in detail a bit that sufficient number of exits by going through the exits. So starting at the main entrance, there was exactly one exit, the revolving door. There was one in the coat check room, but nobody inside knew that was there, and it was only for the person in the coat check who could get to it. And revolving doors are not effective exits in an emergency. Elsewhere in the foyer was a door to the outside at the top of the stairs leading down to the Melody Lounge, so a good 30 feet away from the revolving door. It was labeled as an exit and had panic hardware on the door. Panic hardware are those bars that on the door that all you have to do is push against and it will open, so that if you get pushed up against it and you can't use your hands, your body will open the door for you. Which is, super effective when you're trying to get out in a rush. The problem was, this door was kept locked to prevent guests sneaking out without paying. So that's one exit off already. Well, that's two exits because revolving doors are not emergency exits. Again, they're used to get one person at most, maybe two at most, and at a time. So getting more than one or two out at a time is impossible. So that is not an effective exit. And then the other exit is, locked. So we have 0 sufficient exits at this point. And then windows in the foyer, which were there, were covered with thick black curtains and were hard to see. Now, they still exist. All you had to do was move the curtains, but in a rush, in the blackness of a fire, where it's already smoky and dark, going to be really hard to tell. So, going to rule those out already. So, if you're keeping score at home, we are at 0 sufficient exits. So, the next actual exit we can talk about that's not a window was the door on the Shawmut Street side of the main dining room. Now, this one exit to the outside, the door swung outward. Problem was, it was covered by Venetian doors, to keep up appearances. The problem with this is that there's 2 of them. They slide outward each. So when only one of them opens, you effectively cut your exit in half, your exit width in half, which makes it significantly harder to get out of. Which wouldn't be a problem, except for one of these Venetian doors was locked. So when you try and get out of it, you have to open one of the Venetian doors and then try and open the other one, realize it's locked, and then try and get the outside door open and then squeeze through that, 1.5, 2 foot opening. So we are now still at 0 effective exits because there were windows on the Shawmut Street side, but they were blocked by a fake wooden wall, so no one could get to them. And then we have our last exterior door that patrons actually knew about. This one was on the Broadway lounge that led into a little vestibule that then led to the outside. The problem with this door is it opened inward, meaning that if there was a large amount of people trying to get out of the building all at once, say to get away from a rapidly moving fire, you're not going to be able to open the door unless you've already managed to get it open and wedged it open. So we're going to go ahead and remove this one as a sufficient exit. So we're still sitting at 0 sufficient exits. And then in the Broadway lounge, the only windows there were glass window blocks. And that is an absolute no. You're not getting through that in an emergency. So we're still sitting at a whopping 0. So of all of the potential exits in the Coconut Grove, we are looking at a grand total of 0 that were sufficient of actually getting people out of the building in an emergency in a hurry. Other fire safety that we had inside the building was non-existent. There were 0 fire extinguishers in the entire place. There were 0 sprinklers in the entire place. There were essentially no fire stops anywhere in the entire building. The only technical fire stops would be those that went to the service areas, and that was just because they didn't want the patrons to know they were there. So there were essentially no fire safety in this entire building. The decorations were technically supposed to be flame-proof, and his report did mention that there were no flammable decorations. And in his testimony after the fire, Lieutenant Lenny said that he tested the decorations briefly by holding a match to some of them, and they didn't ignite, which is great, fantastic. Obviously, that's the best way to test if things are flammable or not. Hold them in place and see if they burn. Fantastic. Obviously, that is not the case, but whatever. Now, back to the story here, because we are going to just cruise on past the fact that there was 0 fire safety in this building whatsoever. The building had been issued a restaurant permit with 100 tables, 400 chairs, and 30 stools. The max capacity allowed was somewhere around 400 individuals. Remember that number. It's going to come up later. Alright, so now that we've gone through the actual layout of the building and the fire safety inside or lack thereof, and all of that, we need to get into the actual story and set the scene here. It is Saturday, November 28th, 1942. It's been almost a year since the entrance of the United States into World War II. Things are escalating significantly. Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of North Africa, took off from Virginia, and cities are rapidly falling in Africa. The Battle of Guadalcanal has just taken place in the Pacific, with the U.S. winning the battle, but with massive casualties. People in Boston are looking for a way to escape the war, and the Grove, as it was known, was the perfect place to do it. It was elegant and classy and incredibly popular. The players for the Boston Red Sox and the Boston Bruins, that's the baseball team and the hockey team if you aren't a sports person, made regular appearances at the club for parties and the like. Boston Mayor Maurice Tobin was a regular at the club. In the main dining room, the orchestra would titillate audiences with fantastic songs and floor shows. When famous individuals made appearances at the Grove, former owner and now leader of the orchestra, Mickey Alpert, would announce them as they entered and were escorted up onto the terrace that sat several feet up that gave a great view of everything and allowed those in the less prestigious areas to get a great view of the celebrities always. The Caricature Bar was your standard bar, except it was rumored to be the longest bar in Boston and allowed for friends to meet and get drinks and have a grand old time. The newest attraction, the Broadway Lounge, had just opened and attracted a ton of people for the first non-holiday Saturday night. Because remember, just a week before was Thanksgiving. So this is the first weekend that they have this open that wasn't a holiday where everybody was supposed to be with their families, and it is an absolute party. And then there was the Melody Lounge. It was the date spot. It was dark, romantic, and cozy. With its blue satin ceiling and lights recessed into fake coconuts and fake palm trees, it was a great place to make out with a date, and the Grove knew it. They had a rotating piano downstairs where the pianist would play alongside famous singers that would frequently sing songs that would be a bit suggestive in the more party-esque atmosphere upstairs and really fit with the general vibe of the Melody Lounge. On this particular Saturday, it was going to be a busy night. For starters, as I said, it was the Saturday after Thanksgiving and the second weekend since the Broadway Lounge had opened. This was automatically going to draw more people. But the other major thing that was going on that weekend was a football game. But it wasn't just any football game. The number one ranked in the country, Boston College Eagles, were playing cross-state heated rival, the Holy Cross Crusaders. Yes, that is their mascot. Yes, it is the most fitting mascot in history. This game was a huge deal because not only was it against a rival team, Boston College was the odds-on favorite to be the national champion if they won out. Boston College had already planned a victory party at the Cocoanut Grove that night because it was more or less a done deal that BC would blow out Holy Cross. BC hadn't won a game by less than 27 points in 5 weeks, and Holy Cross was not nearly as good as Boston College. This was the last game of the season. This was for all the marbles. Boston College just had to stomp their rival into the ground, and they were going to play for the national championship. It was a huge deal because Boston College had never won a national championship before. Now, before any Boston College fans come for me in the comments, they do have one claimed national championship in 1940, but it is not recognized by the NCAA, and they were not voted number one in the AP poll. That was Minnesota that year. So do not come for me. You don't have any national championships. That's the end of it. But anyway, the Boston College Eagles were already Orange Bowl bound to play against Alabama, so they were probably looking ahead a bit. And, well, 41,300 people showed up at Fenway Park to watch the game. In an incredible upset, Holy Cross beat the pants off Boston College 55-12. As a result of the game, Boston College canceled their after party because no one wants to party after getting their faces kicked in by their rivals, and that is a face kicking. That is, I don't even have words to describe what that is. That's like, I'm going to explain this in football terms. That is like current Georgia getting stomped by Appalachian State is the best answer I can give, or current Georgia getting stomped by like Akron. You've never heard of Akron. Akron barely has a football team, but they just beat the pants off Georgia. That is a huge deal. Like it was a big deal, and obviously they do not want to party after that because now they've lost any chance at a national championship, barring some claim later on in history because there's lots of national championships. This is not a podcast about football. I'm very sorry. But because Boston College got destroyed, many of their fans decided to go to the Grove anyway, because just because the team wasn't partying and didn't want to have a good time didn't mean the fans weren't going to try and party the memory of this game away. So there were still a ton of people that went to the game that also went to the Grove that night. So the Coconut Grove opened its doors that evening expecting a very full crowd, and a very full crowd indeed showed up. That night, there were well over 1,000 people inside the nightclub in all of the areas. So Melody Lounge, main dining room, caricature bar, into the Broadway Lounge. It was packed. It was slamming. Everybody was having a grand old time, trying to have some nice ice cold drinks, have some fun, do some dancing, have some good food, have some good times, listen to some good music, and forget about the bad things that were happening around the world, and probably forget a football game as well. Stanley Tomaszewski was a 16-year-old boy who had just started working as a bar boy in the Melody Lounge of the Coconut Grove a few weeks earlier. He showed up for work on Saturday, November 28th, 1942, at around 4 p.m. His job was to deliver drinks to tables down in the cozy Melody Lounge. Where Stanley was, the Melody Lounge had become packed very quickly. It had anywhere from 200 to 300 people in it. They were 2 to 3 deep all the way around the bar. It was dark and subdued and the perfect place for some good alone time with a date. Even though it was fully packed, it was dark, and it's one of those things where there's so many people in there that just kind of mind your own business, and everybody else around you just kind of becomes a blur. So you really get into the conversation you're having with your date, or, making out with your date, or whatever, and it becomes much easier to ignore that it's completely full and probably fairly loud. It just kind of becomes a dull background roar. Many of the visitors were just having a grand old time. Two of those visitors were Morris Levy and his wife, Jean Levy. They had decided to go out that night with their friend Florence Zimmerman and her date, Corporal Harold Goldenberg. Because it was date night, the couples had decided on a table down in the romantic Melody Lounge. Roland Sousa had also decided on heading down to the Grove that night for a night out. He decided to head down to the Melody Lounge and was at the bar waiting to order a drink. Joyce Spector was there with her boyfriend Justin Morgan, enjoying a date night out together before Justin joined the Army. Coast Guardman Clifford Johnson was in the main dining room on the first floor inside the Coconut Grove. He was there on a first date and was just enjoying the evening. Eleanor Casella was a coat check girl in the Broadway Lounge. She just started work there on November 24th, literally 4 days earlier. She'd arrived at work around 5 p.m. and was to work the coat check until close. Reno Sandry was sitting in a cab across the street from the Grove waiting for a fare. Sometime around 10 p.m., someone, it's never really been determined who, unscrewed a light bulb in the back left corner of the Melody Lounge. Why the bulb was unscrewed is one of those things that has been argued ever since the actual disaster happened. The most commonly agreed upon theory is that a patron unscrewed it to make the already dark Melody Lounge even darker for himself and his date, which makes sense for this being a fairly popular military town and college game in the area. It makes sense that he would want to make it darker in the corner so that, they can probably make out. Whatever it was, what happened next would set off a chain of events that has never been conclusively determined. Around 10:15 p.m., either the bartender, a man by the name of John Bladley, or the bar boy, Stanley Tomaszewski, realized the light had been unscrewed. Stanley states that John told him to screw it back in. John states that Stanley came and told him it was unscrewed, and he says he told Stanley they can't have that and it need to be screwed back in. And by all accounts, that's what Stanley did. He walked over to the table, informed the patrons seated there that they had to have the light on and they needed to leave it on, and then he climbed up on a piece of furniture to prepare to turn the light back on. Morris Levy was sitting with his wife and friends a table over from the couple that had unscrewed the light bulb. They had arrived around 9:15 and waited upstairs for some room but couldn't find any. Eventually, around 9:30 or so, they went downstairs to the Melody Lounge and made a complete circle around the bar before finally finding the open table in the left-hand corner if you're standing at the base of the stairs. So you walk down the stairs, go all the way around. They were sitting, if you're facing the bar from the bottom of the stairs, you turn to your left, they're sitting in that corner directly basically underneath the stairwell. Around 10 p.m., Morris saw a man at the table next to them reach up and unscrew the light bulb, which plunged the area into darkness. Morris saw a waiter come over, try and read a check, realize the light was out, and climb up on a bench to find the light bulb to screw back in. The waiter couldn't find the bulb, so he pulled a book of matches out of his pocket and lit one in order to see. Stanley Tomaszewski needed to relight that bulb. It was already dark in the Melody Lounge. Unscrewing the bulb had made it worse. After being told it had to be on, he climbed up on a chair and tried to turn the bulb back on. Problem was, he couldn't see the thing, it was so dark. So he did what I think any of us would do. He pulled out a book of matches and lit one for some light. Locating the bulb just fine then, he twisted it back in and it turned on. He climbed back down, stepped on the match on the floor, and started to walk away. That's when someone yelled behind him. He turned around, and the palm tree he had just been next to was on fire. The next thing anyone knew, the leaves of the palm tree were on fire, and it was spreading rapidly. It jumped from the palm tree up to the ceiling and across the blue satin cloth with speed that amazed everyone. Stanley and the bartender John immediately ran at the fire and attempted to extinguish it. First, they tried to smack it with their hands to get it out. That immediately did not work, so they yelled for water. Helpfully, someone got them some water. Unhelpfully, it was literally a cup of water. Not going to do much against this blaze in this highly inflammable environment and already spreading rapidly, they tossed it but did nothing. Stanley and John very quickly realized this was not going to go well for them. The fire rapidly grew out of control and the smoke became incredibly overwhelming, so the two of them led a group of individuals out through a service entrance opposite the stairwell. This was the exit for kitchen staff in and out of the Melody Lounge that had been disguised with the wood paneling that matched the wall that it was on. They went out through this towards the kitchen, but in the ensuing panic of trying to get away from the fire, they forgot about the door to the alley to their left, just inside the actual hallway. So there was an actual exit door. It was locked, but there was an actual exit door to their left that they could have used, and they likely would have had enough time to actually break that door open and get out, but they forgot it was there. Instead, they were able to get into the kitchen and break a basement window and get everyone with them out that way. Across the way at the actual bar, Roland Sousa was enjoying his drink. He could see the palm tree burning, but wasn't overly concerned. He'd seen them burn before. And that's not a joke. Sousa told investigators during his interview that he had seen the actual palm trees on fire numerous times, and every time someone had just patted them out or they'd successfully doused it with water. That was a regular thing, apparently. He heard someone yell, "Put it out, put it out," and then the flames hit the ceiling. He'd never seen that before. In just a few seconds, flames were rolling at him, and he decided it was time to get out of there. He made his way towards the stairs, but it was already a logjam of people trying to escape the basement. And that is where his memory blacks out. He has no memory after that. Someone obviously carried him out of the building, but who carried him out of the building, or how they got him out of the building, or where exactly he made it to or laid and was found in the aftermath of the fire is lost. The next thing he knows, he was waking up in the hospital. That is it. That is all that he remembers. He remembers seeing it. He remembers the flames hitting the ceiling and thinking to himself, that's weird. It's time to leave, and then trying to get out and getting stuck and then passing out. Morris Levy watched Stanley light the match, screw in the bulb, then climb back down. The next thing he saw was the entire top of the tree on fire, then quickly spread to the ceiling and continue on. Morris grabbed his wife Jean by the hand and immediately headed for the stairs. When he hit the bottom of the stairs, the flames were about 10 feet behind him. When Morris and his wife made it to the top of the stairs, the flames had moved over his head and were now in the upstairs foyer about 10 feet in front of him. But he now had a problem. Morris knew that the revolving door was the closest exit to him, but everyone in the lobby was flowing towards the main dining room and the Broadway lounge. He knew that was not where he wanted to be, still inside the burning building. Sounds like a nightmare. So he pushed his way through the crowds towards the closest exit. Unfortunately, there was a decent reason that everyone was shoving towards the main dining room. The revolving door was a massive crush of people because revolving doors aren't supposed to be used in an emergency. They are literally designed so only a few can go out or in at a time, which is quite the opposite of what you need when you're trying to escape a building that is actively burning. But Morris pushed his way to the front and then through the door. He managed to stumble outside. He turned around in time to see the fire flash out the door, and the man who tried to escape behind him, burned to death, jammed in the doorway. Now, I just want to talk about this for a minute. Morris made it out of this building. He is probably a little bit singed, but mostly unhurt. He is the last one to make it out of the revolving door. He turns around and watches as the man that was behind him, that he could probably feel and hear as he was going through the door, as he was trying to escape the building, watches him literally light on fire and burn to death. And burning to death is probably one of the worst ways to go in any capacity. It is not quick. It is not painless. It is horrifying. So he has to turn around and realize that if he had been 2 seconds slower, if he'd been 3 seconds slower, that would be him burning to death, trapped in a revolving door. He went to this club with his wife to have a great time. And now he's watching a man that was literally directly behind him burn to death, trapped in a revolving door, in a place that was supposed to be full of merriment, full of fun, full of good times, full of good drinks, full of good friends. That is going to mess with you for a long time. And it's unlikely that in the moment he realized the gravity of the situation. But just think about that. Think about how many people that made it out that turned around and watched the person that was directly behind them die in one of the most horrifying ways imaginable. Because it's painful. He likely screamed and he likely suffered immensely as this massive fire that started just a few seconds before, a few minutes before, flashes out and roasts him alive as Morris is sit there and forced to watch this horrifying thing happen. But that's just the start of the horror that Morris was going to have to go through, because if you remember, something is missing here. When Morris left the basement, he had pulled his wife along with him. When he got out the door, his wife was no longer with him. He knew she made it to the top of the stairs with him. They made it out of the Melody Lounge together. But at some point during the crush inside the building, from going towards the main dining room and Morris fighting his way across the crowd to make it out the revolving door, he lost Jean in the crowd. Unfortunately, he would never see her alive again. Jean Levy would never make it out of the Grove. She died inside the building somewhere, one of the victims of the Cocoanut Grove fire. Joyce Spector and her boyfriend Justin were sitting one table over from the individual who unscrewed the light bulb. She watched him unscrew the bulb and told her it was because he wanted darkness. The waiter, Stanley, came over and said his boss was watching and he needed to turn the light back on. He climbed up on the chair, lit the match, found the bulb, and twisted it back on. They were relieved to have the light back on so they could, see. She said there was a spark, and then the palm tree caught fire. She jumped out of her chair and watched the fire spread across the ceiling and down on the floor. Her boyfriend Justin leapt up to try and put the fire out. She said to Justin, this is what she said, "I will meet you in the lobby. There's no use staying here." Which is an utterly wild thing to say to someone who is actively trying to extinguish a fire that she is watching spread across the ceiling rapidly. Joyce went upstairs and went into the ladies' room. Again, wild choices here from Joyce. She told the people in the ladies' room that there is a little fire downstairs, which is quite the understatement when she herself said it had spread across the ceiling and down on the floor. That is not a little fire. That is a large fire, but Joyce operates on a different wavelength than the rest of us, apparently. While she was in the bathroom, smoke started to pour in under the door, which either she was in the bathroom for a really long time or the fire was a little bit bigger than she said it was when she walked into the bathroom. The door opens and fills the room with black smoke and the lights go out. She began to attempt to make her way out towards the revolving door out onto Piedmont Street, but the crowd was too packed, so she allowed herself to be pushed along with the flow of the crowd. At some point, she was knocked in the head and knocked to the floor and was repeatedly trampled by those attempting to escape. She was stepped on, kicked, knocked around, and all around being beaten. While laying on the ground, she began to feel the flames licking at her feet and ankles, so she did the only thing she could think to do. She began to crawl on her hands and knees towards what she hoped was an exit. And this is likely what saved her life unknowingly. Because she didn't stand up, because instead of trying to stand up and walk out, she was able to stay below the upper smoke layer in some at least moderately decent oxygen level. Now, that's a thing that is often talked about in fire safety, is that if you wake up to your house full of smoke, is to always crawl. That's because that is where the best oxygen is. Obviously, smoke and heat rise, so if you can stay below that black smoke layer, you have a much, much better chance of survival. So the fact that she couldn't get up off her hands and knees probably, and it did, it saved her life. Eventually, she made it across the dance floor in a very dark, smoky area, and all around her were bodies of other people. She managed to shove her way towards the door, but became stuck. It was at this point that she probably gave up a lot of hope and thought, I'm going to die inside this club. But at that point, someone realized that the girl that had just managed to make it to the exit was still alive. So they grabbed her by the head and yanked her outside. She emerged from the Coconut Grove with second-degree burns on her right hand, her shoulders, her legs, blisters on her face, and most of her hair singed. Her boyfriend Justin, who had just joined the army, never made it out alive. He died somewhere inside Coconut Grove. The last time she saw him alive, he was trying to extinguish the fire as it began down in the Melody Lounge. Daniel Weiss was a cashier in the Melody Lounge that night. His job was to make sure nobody left without paying their tab. It was a normal Saturday night. The music was good, the mood was high, everyone was having a great time. Off in the corner, he could see a commotion starting. At first, he thought it was a fight. Then he saw the flames. Nobody seemed to move at all, and the music continued as if it was just a normal night. But then the fire spread quickly. Daniel noticed in the moment the music had stopped, but the noise level hadn't dropped. It had just turned to screams. Now think about that for a moment. You're in a club. Music's playing. Everybody's having a good time. You're hearing laughter. You're hearing the general chatter of, people having conversations, laughing, drinking, doing the normal thing. There's a piano going, somebody's singing, people are singing along. It's just kind of a general murmur underneath the music. And then all of a sudden, you see this thing in the distance, and it takes all of your attention. And you kind of, at that point, you're not really listening. You're more looking, and your ears kind of shut off a little bit. And then you realize what it is, and it's a fire. And it starts to spread. And then you hear one piercing scream, and it snaps you back to reality. And all of a sudden, the music is gone. The laughter is gone. The general murmur is gone. The only thing you can hear is maybe the subtle sound of the crackling fire, but also just screams. There's 300 people down there. They're all trying to get out. There's screams. There's yelling. You're stuck behind this counter at a cash register, and your one job is to make sure that everyone pays. Make sure that nothing happens to that money. But what are you supposed to do in that moment when there's a fire and it's rapidly coming right at you, and everyone is making a mad dash for the stairs, and everyone is screaming? Daniel watched from behind his counter as everyone attempted to get out via the stairs out of the Melody Lounge, and then watched in sheer terror from a front row view as the fire flashed up the stairs and burned people to death. He watched it light their hair and their clothes and listened to them scream in terror and agony as they burned to death in front of him. Those people that just a few minutes ago had been having a grand old time, laughing, singing, cheering, drinking with their friends and their dates, are now in an absolute nightmare scenario, burning to death in front of his very eyes. He decided in this moment it was time for him to go, and went to grab the gate to get out of his area, but right as he got there, the lights went out. Plunged into total darkness, he dropped to the ground. Daniel reached up onto the bar and soaked a towel in water to cover his face. He laid there for an unknown amount of time. He laid there and listened to those in the Melody Lounge scream for help, scream in terror, scream in agony, and then it slowly faded from a scream to a low moaning, to a crackling sound, to a scratching sound on wood. And then the moaning, scratching, and crackling sound slowly faded to a complete and utter eerie silence as those trapped in the lounge died one by one, trapped there. Now, utter silence in a burning building is never a good sign, ever. And Daniel realized that, and he realized it was time that he really, really, really needed to get out. So he sucked in as much clean oxygen as he could from where he was laying and jumped over the counter. What he expected to land on and what he actually landed on were wildly different. He was expecting to land on the hard floor. Instead, what he landed on was a massive pile of dead bodies. He, in terror, quickly crawled away from there in the direction of the service door into the kitchen area. He was able to get the door open and into the kitchen, where miraculously he found multiple people still alive huddling together. Weiss decided to head up the kitchen stairs toward the main dining room, and about halfway up the stairs was hit by an excruciating heat, discovering the rest of the club was now actively burning. He then realized there was another exit out onto Shawmut Street through the storage area behind the kitchen and the heating plant. He led a few guests that direction, but when he opened the door to the heater room, some of them panicked by the sight of the glowing heater and ran back into the kitchen, thinking they were leading him towards the fire. He followed, trying to convince them it was safe, but they wouldn't listen, so he went out himself and promised to send help behind. Some of the people that he met in the basement that night made it out. Some of them would not. At this point, we need to discuss the actual spread of this fire. We know from several witnesses the fire began in a corner of the Melody Lounge at the level of the fabric hanging from the ceiling near the top of a fake palm tree. This tree, as we have covered, was made of paper. It was originally supposed to be fireproof, but that was a full 3 years ago, and instructions from the installer was to reapply the fireproofing every 6 months. There is, again, zero evidence that actually ever happened. Same with the fabric up above. It was supposed to be reapplied once a year, but there's no evidence to say that fabric was fireproofed after installation. What this means was the fire had a fantastic starting fuel source to really get this fire going. One of the things we should talk about here, though, is room orientation. Not all fires burn the same way in every spot in a room. If you think about the Melody Lounge, it was a long rectangle. A fire that starts in the middle of the room, heat moves away from the fire in all directions, meaning that the fire is slightly cooler, which takes longer for things around it to ignite. If the fire was halfway up a wall in a corner, the heat would be radiated out in 2 directions on either side of the corner is reflected back, making the fire slightly hotter. So if you start a fire in the corner halfway up, the 2 walls on either side are going to reflect heat back onto the fire, making it slightly hotter, which means that heat is being added to whatever the next fuel source is to make it ignite slightly faster. Now, because this fire was up in the corner at the ceiling level, the heat is being reflected back from 3 different directions. Because of this, the fire is even hotter and is outputting more heat. If you think back to the Grenfell Tower episode, as the fire was traveling between the insulation and the cladding there, it was preheating the cladding before the fire reached it, allowing it to ignite that much faster. So because of where this fire was in the Melody Lounge, everything was reaching its ignition temperature significantly quicker, which contributed to the rapid spread of the fire across the ceiling. Now, the fire would have spread across the ceiling rather quickly anyway, because this was a fabric and it's a stretched across fabric with lots of folds and all of that, so there's plenty of surface area to already start spreading this fire through. So you've got a ton of available fuel and a ton of surface area to get hot really quickly. So this fire was always going to spread quickly once it got to the ceiling. And because it started near the ceiling, that made it move so much faster. But the doubly big problem for this is that because this fire was moving so quickly, the superheated gases and the smoke and the fire were going to be traveling upwards. And because this fire started in the basement, the one way to go upwards is up the stairs. And unfortunately, the only well-known exit for patrons in the lounge was the stairwell. This stairwell would have quickly funneled the heat and hot gas up as though it were a chimney. So when people were on the stairs, there's going to be fire and hot gas and smoke coming up behind them. And because it is a stairwell, it's harder to crawl up, and likely many people were standing. So when that fire hit the bottom of that stairwell and started to shoot up and all of that hot gases, people had likely stuck their head up into that hot gas and died. They would have been overcome by smoke rapidly in that stairwell and then made it impassable. The stairwell down to the Melody Lounge or up out of the Melody Lounge would have quickly become choked with dead bodies, or if not dead, rapidly dying people. And then, if you were lucky enough to make it up the stairs of the Melody Lounge to try that door that says exit at the top of the stairs with the panic hardware on it, you would have found it locked, and you would have had to hope that you could make it somewhere else to get out, because that fire was coming at you, and it was coming at you quickly, and there was no turning back then. There was no way to, because you would have had to climb over so many people if they were not already pushing you past. It was a literal nightmare, and that stairwell would have gotten extremely hot extremely quickly. All right, so we have the fire coming up the stairwell. It comes around the corner, and it's going to launch through the foyer. People in the foyer have two options to get away from this very aggressive flame front coming at them. Option one was the closest exit, which was the revolving door. Many people in the lobby chose this way. Unfortunately, it would not end well for a lot of them. Very quickly, the revolving door became overwhelmed with bodies of people trying to escape not only the fire, but the crush that was quickly developing, both inside the building and inside the actual revolving door. It quickly became a wall of bodies, both those dead and those still alive, trying to make it out of the inferno now roaring behind them. The other option was to head towards the main dining room, and once the revolving door became impassable, that is what most people chose. Was they headed towards the main dining room because many of them knew that there were other exits besides that revolving door. Reno Sandry, the taxi driver from earlier, was sitting across from 17 Piedmont Street waiting on a fare. He was waiting patiently when he began to hear loud screaming coming from the area of the Coconut Grove nightclub. He looked over at the entrance and could see a crowd of people at the revolving door. Just behind them, he could see the start of flames beginning to reach them. As he approached the door of the Grove, he could see that people were trapped in the doorway. He could see men and women screaming and pleading for help. And at this point, the flames were right at the people. All he could see inside was a large mass of humanity and the orange glow of fire getting closer and closer to the people. It is likely that many people tried to help pull people out of the revolving door after the fire had already gotten there. And it is very likely that because of how many people were trapped in this doorway and stuck, that when they latched onto those people's arms to pull them out or whatever they grabbed, their skin came off in their hands. So, person in the door was grabbed by someone outside, the person outside yanked, and the person trapped in the door's skin came off with them because they would have been likely very burned. And those on the bottom of the pile maybe were still alive and were slowly being suffocated by those on top of the pile. Those on top of the pile were being burned to death. This is quite literally a nightmare scenario. There is no escape from this pile unless you manage to get lucky and squirm your way out. You either crushing to death underneath or you're burning to death up top. And just to make it worse, you are crushing to death while you can actively see safety, or you are burning to death where you can actively see safety. You are literally inches from freedom. You are inches from survival, and that's where you die. Trapped in a revolving door, stuck, feeling the flames getting closer to you, feeling that heat getting closer to you, unable to move, unable to breathe, unable to do anything. Just inches from freedom. At this point, the fire is oxygen starved and is heading anywhere there is more oxygen available. Unfortunately for those in the lobby, that is the main dining room. It's unfortunate because the crowd was pushing everyone that way, directly away from the fire and to the only known exits that weren't currently blocked. It was also unfortunate because the main dining room had the same fuel load as the Melody Lounge, a ton of fake paper plants, and a ceiling covered in fabric. Those in the caricature bar would see the fire coming from the lobby. They had two options to escape: go through the passage to the Broadway Lounge and get out that way, or across the main dining room to the Shawmut Street exit. Those in the main dining room saw the fire flash in over the caricature bar and set items and people on fire in there. Then it came at them. They also had two options. Unfortunately, they were the same two options as those in the caricature bar: the Shawmut Street exit or through the passageway to the Broadway Lounge. Many in both the caricature bar and the main dining room chose the passageway. Unfortunately, this made a massive jam of people in a small hallway, and the fire was coming. Clifford Johnson was on a first date in the main floor dining room. All of a sudden, there was a commotion from the area of the Melody Lounge. Many in the dining room thought it was a fight between Boston College fans and Holy Cross fans, as there had been simmering hostilities there all evening after the Holy Cross beatdown earlier that day. But then they heard screaming, and a fireball erupted from downstairs into the lobby and across towards the dining room. Clifford Johnson was not slow to react. He grabbed the hand of his date, Estelle Balkin, and headed for the door. Clifford made it out of the building fairly easily, but he realized Estelle wasn't with him. So back in the building he went. He found someone who needed help, pulled them out, then went back in. 4 separate times. On his last attempt, still unable to find Estelle, he emerged literally on fire. Like, that's not an exaggeration. The man was literally engulfed in flames. They had to put him out. Think the steward in Lord of the Rings throwing himself off Minas Tirith. Literally on fire. He would end up with third-degree burns on 55% of his body. Even with modern medicine, Menem people do not survive that. But a year and some change later, after hundreds of procedures and incredible suffering, Clifford Johnson would walk out of the hospital under his own power with no disabilities. In the end, he would marry one of his nurses and move to Missouri. 14 years later, he was driving home from work in his fuel truck, and it would skid off the road, roll over, burst into flames, and he would burn to death inside the cab. Because, of course, that's how it ended. Oh, and his date, Estelle? Yeah, she had already made it out of the Grove before he'd made any of his attempts to find her. She just made it out separately from him, and he had no idea because he lost her in the crush of the crowd. Eleanor Casella was the coat check girl in the Broadway Lounge. Everything had been a normal night so far for Eleanor. It was moderately busy, but she said that there were a couple open tables and people were in and out all night, and she had a 75-ish coats in her coat check, but she'd checked people in and out several times, so she wasn't sure exactly how many people they were, but it wasn't, full to the brim packed in the new Broadway Lounge, but it was fairly normal. There was music playing, they were singing, they were dancing, they were drinking, just generally having a good time. All of a sudden, someone yelled at her to put on her hat and coat and run. Then a large group of men began demanding their coats to leave. And then, off in the distance, she could see smoke enter the room from across the way at the bar, which was weird. That's unusual. There's not normally smoke. She could see the singer on the stage, Maxine Coleman, singing a song and having a good time. And then the smoke came around Maxine. She thought that was a little weird. And then almost as soon as she realized it was smoke, around the corner, a massive wall of flame emerged. She watched as Maxine had no time to react. And then all of a sudden, Maxine was on fire while she was singing. She watched Maxine Coleman burn to death inside the Cocoanut Grove. But this was all the evidence Eleanor needed that it was actually time to get out of the building. She managed to make it out of the coat check room and push her way to the door, but couldn't get out as it was jammed shut. And obviously the reason for this was because that was an inward swinging door, and there was already a crush of people trying to get out of it. So, since everyone was pushed up against it in the rush to get out, it wouldn't open any longer. Eventually, someone managed to get the door open, and Eleanor would be able to make it out. Now, elsewhere in the Broadway lounge, they realized that this fire was coming, and the inward swinging door was not working. And some people, in a desperate attempt to get out and avoid a terrible fate, began to break out the glass tile blocks of the window. One guy managed to get several out and managed to stick at least a portion of his body out. Firefighters on the outside would attempt to help him out, but unfortunately they would watch him burn to death, trapped in the window. Now at this point you probably are wondering where the fire department is. Well, in an incredible twist, they were just about 3 blocks away from the Coconut Grove. At around 10:15, right as the fire was just starting in the Melody Lounge, Engine 22 and Ladder 13 were called out to a car fire on Stewart Street. While they were using an extinguisher to put out the car fire, a person ran up to the captain of Engine 22 and told him there was a fire at the Coconut Grove. So he had his crew quickly drive over to the nightclub. What he found was an absolute nightmare. Heavy smoke was visible on all sides. People were desperately trying to shove their way out of the building. He could see flames on all sides, with an orange glow emanating out from behind what was a giant mass of something. He quickly realized that giant mass of something was a giant pile of human bodies. At 10:20, as Engine 22 and Ladder 13 were headed towards the Grove, the local fire alarm box was pulled by a civilian bystander for the Coconut Grove fire. In a likely combination of realizing this fire was big enough that it could not effectively be extinguished by just his engine and ladder companies, and the fact that this was going to be a massive rescue operation, he told one of his firefighters to skip the second alarm and go right to a third alarm for this fire. That was at 10:23 p.m. Literally 1 minute later, the fourth alarm was pulled at 10:24 p.m. Firefighters on Engine 22 immediately tried to make entry into the Broadway Lounge doorway, but couldn't. Not because the door wouldn't open. No, they couldn't get in because so many bodies had piled up in the doorway that people were stacked up to chest height. That is, laying flat, bodies were stacked up chest height on a full-grown firefighter. That is at least 5 feet of bodies. At least. At minute, like, that is terrifying. It's the only way I can describe it. And on top of that horrifying thought, fire was actively blowing through the gap between the people pile and the top of the door. So anyone on top of the pile was actively being roasted. Firefighters did the only thing they could think to do, and that was spray the hose at the fire blowing through the gap, which would kind of help them be able to slowly unstack the carnage at the door and pull people out, which the people on top of the pile are going to be severely burnt. So when firefighters grab onto them, it's likely that their clothes and their skin is coming off instead of the people coming off of the pile. This response quickly went from extinguish the fire to rescue mission. Putting out the fire became almost a second thought. There were so many people to get out of this building and so few rescuers to actually do it. At the Shawmut Street entrance, the door that had the Venetian doors you had to slide open before opening the exterior door, only one of the Venetian doors managed to be opened because the other one was locked. So everyone was trying to fit out an approximately 2.5-foot entrance generously. The doorway quickly became overwhelmed and piled high with bodies. But I don't want you to think that all of these people were dead in the pile. This is very important. The people on top, where the fire's blowing out, are likely either dead or dying. The people on the very bottom are being slowly crushed and are likely dead or dying. The people in the middle of this pile are likely still alive and very aware of what is going on. One firefighter began trying to extricate people stuck in the pile at the Shawmut Street exit and had to back up because his hands were burning and he was breathing in heavy smoke. When he managed to pull away, he had nail marks up and down his legs from people grabbing onto him, trying to get him to pull them out. Think about that. That is terrifying. You are doing your best. You have walked up to a building that is on fire that you're probably fairly used to. Boston's a big city. There's likely a lot of fires there. You find a wall of writhing flesh that you realize is a bunch of people. Many of them burned unrecognizably. And you go to try and help them, and there are so many people, so many hands sticking out that they have such a death grip. They're trying to get out so badly that they are leaving claw marks in your skin in their desperation to escape the horrifying conditions that are happening behind them. And that's just the people that can reach. That's not including whoever is stuck behind this pile that literally has no way to get out at this point. At one point, when firefighters were attempting to pull people out, they would accidentally pull off entire limbs because people were so burnt that there was nothing left holding them together. This was a scene of absolute horror. And it was not any better on the outside once you made it out, because many of the people that actually made it out of the building took a deep breath of fresh air and dropped dead on the spot. Fairly quickly after the fire department arrived, the fire was out. It was out in about 10, maybe 15 minutes. As firefighters slowly cleared space to make entry into the building, they found new horrors inside. Many people had never even been able to make it out of their seats. Bodies were slumped in chairs, overcome with toxic gases right where they sat. Those in the terrace area of the main dining room suffered the worst due to the height it sat off of the floor. Famous Western movie star Buck Jones was making an appearance with a group of people to celebrate the night in the Cocoanut Grove. It's been stated that Buck didn't want to go out that night because he had a slight illness, but was talked into making an appearance anyway. When firefighters managed to make entry into the building and get to him, he was found severely burned, laying underneath the table he was seated at, but still alive somehow. Unfortunately, Buck Jones would die a few days later in the hospital from his burns. This was a similar scene throughout the club. Anyone still alive inside on the main floor was severely burnt and died rather quickly. In the passageway between the caricature bar, the main dining room, and the Broadway lounge, a large pile of people were found having been unable to figure out which way to go after running into each other and then succumbing to the rapidly approaching smoke and flames. Some firefighters who made their way into the Melody Lounge found a young woman who seemed virtually untouched by the fire. Her hair was perfect, her makeup was untouched, and her hand was still around her drink on the table. The only thing off was the slight black marks around her nose and mouth, and she was perfectly still, completely dead. This was a common scene throughout the club. People sitting at their chairs, hands around their drinks, dead. Completely dead. With very minimal of any damage anywhere. They had burns around their noses and mouths and black soot around their noses and mouths, indicating that they died from smoke inhalation, and that was it. Pretty quickly, Boston realized it had a major problem. First of all, there were a lot of injuries and victims that needed transport. There were only so many available transports, so those around the Grove did what they could and made makeshift ambulances out of anything they could get their hands on. Taxis, delivery trucks, private vehicles, and the like were all used to transport the injured and the dying. They also realized there was no way they could transport the deceased to the morgue with how many were already dead outside of the building. So the fire department took over a garage across the street to use as a makeshift morgue where nearly 150 bodies were laid while they continued rescue and recovery operations inside the Grove itself. There were a lot of victims in this fire, and many of them would go two places: Massachusetts General Hospital and Boston City Hospital. Somewhere around 300 patients arrived at Boston City Hospital alive, and around 114 arrived at Massachusetts General alive. Very quickly, 270 people died at Boston City, and 75 died at Massachusetts General. Boston disaster planners had studied the response to the Blitz in London, and it was thought that there would be a 4-to-1 ratio of injured to dead/dying. That was not the case here because of how the fire spread. Doctors and nurses at both hospitals had no triage system in place. In the modern day, there is a color coding for mass casualty incidents. Green is for walking wounded, anyone that is injured but can get themselves out or transport themselves to the hospital. These are treated last. There's yellow, which is basically someone who is injured but can wait to be treated. So if you have a slightly broken leg or arm or something of that nature, you can wait to be transported and they can come back to you later and you'll still be alive. Probably grumpy, but alive. These are treated second. Red is for people who can live if there are immediate interventions. These are things like being impaled, chest wounds, open fractures. So that means if your arm or something has broken and it's sticking out of your skin, that's an open fracture. And then some levels of second and third degree burns. Things that cannot wait for intervention. These are treated first. And of course, last is black. Black is dead or almost dead. These are usually very obvious: decapitations, severe burns, lack of heartbeat, all of that kind of stuff. And these are not treated at all. This did not exist in 1942. What this meant is that as these victims came into the hospitals, nurses and doctors spent a lot of time and effort trying to either save or resuscitate victims who were either already dead or very obviously very close to dead and then died a few minutes later. This meant that those who would in the modern day be marked red, who have survivable injuries if treated immediately, died very quickly with zero intervention. This quickly raised the death toll very high. But not all of the response at the hospital was terrible. You see, this thing called World War II was going on, and the United States had watched the Blitz in London and had learned from it. Many of the wounds in the Blitz, and also Pearl Harbor, were burns. The U.S. medical community had realized this was an area they were behind in, and several studies were started to better understand burns and the treatment of burns. So both hospitals were very, very well stocked on medical supplies, and coincidentally, burn treatment research was being performed at both Boston City Hospital and Massachusetts General. Therefore, they were uniquely set up in order to be able to respond to a situation of this level of burn victims. Now, that's not to say that they were perfectly set up. It's very hard to receive that many patients, regardless of how prepared you are. That is an overflow of patients in general. But, conveniently, the fire happened at shift change for both hospitals, so they had double the number of hands as normal to help deal with the influx of burn victims. Outside of the very obvious burns, one of the big issues many of the injured had were respiratory issues. We know now that smoke has a ton of toxic material in it that can create inflammation and other damage inside the lungs when you breathe in too much and too often. This became very apparent when several burn victims actually walked into the hospital under their own power and then dropped dead just a few minutes later. Many of the dead inside the Cocoanut Grove weren't even burnt, they were just dead. Autopsies afterward revealed they had severe damage inside their lungs and down their throat. Two of the victims had blood carbon monoxide levels of 42% and 50% respectively, which back then had been considered too low for death, but studies have shown recently that a significant amount of fatalities studied in fires had carbon monoxide levels lower than 60%. This is because of other toxins in the actual smoke. So your carbon monoxide is causing a lot of the issues, but the other toxins that are present in the smoke is contributing to the death and causing death in people that inhale smoke significantly at levels lower than what you would expect with just straight up carbon monoxide poisoning. Many of the victims that entered hospitals initially showed signs of improvement, but their respiratory distress quickly became very apparent and they declined significantly, with several succumbing to their injuries and dying. Doctors at the hospital thought that there was some type of unknown toxic gas that had spread throughout the building to explain why all of these victims were suffering such significant respiratory problems that were not consistent with burn victims they had seen before, but were consistent with one other tragic fire, the instance they had heard of, the Cleveland Clinic fire. Now, the Cleveland Clinic fire was a fire back in the 1920s where a bunch of nitrocellulose x-rays caught on fire in the basement of the Cleveland Clinic, and it put out an extremely toxic gas that caused serious breathing problems in several doctors and killed, I believe it was 8 off the top of my head. And that was one of the first times that they had seen this kind of lung damage in the aftermath of a fire. Now, obviously, they'd seen lung damage in other things like, mustard gas in World War One. They compared it to this, but it was slightly different. It was really the Cleveland Clinic fire that gave them the idea that maybe there was some kind of toxic gas inside the Cocoanut Grove that was causing, this massive lung damage below the vocal cords. Because this isn't like they have breathing issues because their throat is burned or their mouth is burned. They have actual damage inside their actual lungs and down through past the vocal cords and down into the lungs, causing massive problems. The big difference between the Cleveland Clinic fire and the Cocoanut Grove fire deaths was that the Cleveland Clinic fire deaths had a large amount of fluid in their lungs on autopsy. The Cocoanut Grove fire deaths did not. What one doctor realized that there was no specific toxic gas that caused these respiratory injuries. It was the actual smoke itself, which we know now. Many of the victims who had the worst respiratory symptoms were those with burns around their noses and mouths and who had passed out in the nightclub and been carried out after having been found. These had been exposed to the most smoke for the longest time for obvious reasons. Now, those who had covered their mouths with a wet cloth and escaped but still had burns, of which there were many, still had burns on their body, but almost zero respiratory problems because they had been able to filter out the smoke with the wet washcloth. One of the doctors at Boston City Hospital, Dr. Maxwell Finland, mapped out the locations of all those victims inside the actual grove, and they were spread evenly throughout the entire club, which indicated that there was no localized source of gas, and therefore the actual issue here is that smoke contains more than just hot gas and carbon monoxide, and it can cause significant major respiratory problems because you're breathing in all of that heat and it's going to cause damage inside your lungs. You are fully breathing it in, it's going to burn inside your lungs, and all of those toxins are going to cause issues. So what they learned from this particular, the respiratory section, is that obviously those that are burned and also have been breathing in the smoke are going to have a significantly higher chance of dying than those that are just burnt. They have two modes of damage to their body, and one of them is arguably worse than the other. They also learned that those that are in respiratory distress that have inhaled all of that smoke are going to require a bunch more fluid to actually treat them and keep them from continuously degrading to the point that they die, because being burnt requires you get a lot of fluid. It causes damage to your body, and so you need extra fluids brought in. But when you have that extra burning inside your lungs from breathing in those hot gases, you need even more because you're going to be losing more and more fluid than if you were just burned on the exterior of your body. But one of the things that you have to realize is that even now, even with all of our advances in medical technology and all of that, those that breathe in a significant amount of smoke will always be at a higher risk of dying, regardless of how they're treated. It will always be those in respiratory distress after a fire will have a higher chance of dying. The treatment of shock also changed in the aftermath of this fire. Basically, what happens when your body is burned is it begins to shift around fluid inside your body, and you quickly lose large amounts of fluid, causing dehydration. What they realized was already more or less known. You need a ton of fluid when you are burnt to keep from declining rapidly, but what they also realized ties back to the bit about respiratory distress. Those who have breathed in a significant amount of smoke need way more fluid. The victims in the Cocoanut Grove fire who went to Massachusetts General that had significant respiratory distress issues were intentionally given slightly less plasma than those not in respiratory distress because doctors were concerned this would result in a significant amount of fluid in the lungs. This proved to be wrong and just prolonged their suffering. So what they learned in treating burn shock was basically give them a ton of fluids. If they're in respiratory distress because of the fire, give them even more fluids. This was, again, already mostly known, but it was one of those things where we were able to reinforce our assumptions based on real-world unfortunate incidents. Also, The type of dressing needed for burns was also more or less confirmed during the aftermath of the Cocoanut Grove fire. Prior to this, there had been a host of different ways to try to dress burns, one of them involving tannic acid and careful debridement of the burns, which led to a lot of infections because tannic acid is basically tanning your skin after you've pulled it all off after it's been burned. It's not great. Showing the lower level of your dermis and then sticking acid on it is, at least tannic acid's not great, and then also not really doing a great job of bandaging it. It's not great. Anyway, early in World War II, the massive amount of burn wounds required something quicker and easier to do because, again, it's hard to debride a burn in the middle of a battlefield on an island in the Pacific or in some random forest in Europe or in the desert of North Africa. You cannot sit there carefully while things are blowing up around you and just pick skin off. That's terrible, and it's also going to lead to an infection because it's not like it's sterile there. So they made changes, and the one that won out was packing the burn with gauze for pressure and boric acid ointment. This was used to great success at both hospitals in Boston. And then in our continuation of treating this massive amount of burns, the first decision that was made by the administration of Massachusetts General Hospital was to clear out an entire surgical floor and dedicate it only to the victims of the Cocoanut Grove fire. They maintained strict isolation from the rest of the hospital, and nurses and doctors took great care to clean everything so infection was minimized. They had separate areas of the floor for wound care, respiratory care, and administration of medicine. This was one of the first dedicated burn units in the United States, but it quickly became a standard across the country as hospitals realized just how effective it was. In the end, the Cocoanut Grove fire killed 492 people, with 130 injured, making it the second deadliest structure fire in U.S. history, behind only the Iroquois Theater fire. An investigation into the fire was immediately called, before the fire was even out. What the investigation uncovered, we mostly already know. Many of the exits from the Cocoanut Grove were blocked or locked. The Grove had exactly 0 permits from the city to actually do any of the things they were doing. They had no food handlers permits. They had no liquor license, nothing. The owner of the Grove, Barnett Wolanski, had openly bragged that he didn't actually need licenses because he was in with the mayor. The mayor, of course, denied this aggressively. Stanley Tomaszewski was underage, working in the bar, and should have never been there. This is also when the inspection of the Cocoanut Grove before the fire came to light. Lenny was charged with accessory after the fact of manslaughter and willful neglect of duty. He went on trial in October of 1943, but was found not guilty. The reasoning for the not guilty finding was that while he had not done a good job, he had met the standard that had been set in Boston before the fire for doing his job, which that level was very bad, but technically that is true. He did meet the level that was required of him before the fire. Also arrested in the aftermath of the disaster was the owner of the nightclub, Barnett Wolanski. He was charged with 19 counts of manslaughter. 19 because 19 victims were chosen from the dead at random to represent the dead from the club. He was convicted in 1943 and sentenced to 12 to 15 years in prison. This was actually a major case because it proved that manslaughter did not have to be from simply doing something to cause death, but also by the omission of doing something that was known needed to be done when there is a duty to care. In this case, he invited the public into his establishment and essentially gave them the understanding it would be safe, and then they died. That is reckless disregard for their safety and was the basis for his conviction. He would end up serving a grand total of 3 years for this crime. The mayor of Boston, who he had bragged about being in with, so he didn't need licenses for anything, Maurice Tobin, had been elected governor and had then pardoned him. Because, of course he did. Why would you not pardon the guy that you claimed to not know at all and that none of the things he said were true? When Wolanski was released from prison, he told press, "I wish I died with the others in the fire." Wolanski would die 9 weeks after his release in 1947 of cancer. The official investigation report from the Boston Fire Commissioner ruled this to be an undetermined fire. Now, part of that was that he more or less blamed Tomaszewski for setting the fire by saying that he stuck the lit match up into the actual palm fronds and all of that and all that. They exonerated him by saying he was not responsible for the terrible fire safety conditions inside the club, and because he was 16, he shouldn't have been working there anyway. But until the end of his life, basically, Stanley Tomaszewski was ostracized by many of the people in Boston. But that's not how we're going to end this here, because we're going to do a deep dive into the cause of this fire, because I have thoughts and opinions. So the origin of this fire really isn't up for debate. We have multiple witnesses putting the fire in at least ceiling level in the Melody Lounge. No one is really debating it. It is in the back left corner of the Melody Lounge at ceiling level. If you're facing the bar, it is the back left corner at ceiling level. No one is really debating that. There are multiple witnesses saying, I saw the fire start here. That's totally fine. Totally in agreement about that. There has been some debate on whether or not the fire actually started in the room behind the Melody Lounge, that little hallway, but I think we can effectively rule that out, because if the fire had started back in that hallway where those compressors were, then there should have been significant smoke and flame in that area when all of the workers of the Melody Lounge escaped that way. But there was very minimal smoke in the kitchen. Even when Daniel Weiss made it out, he made it out after the fire had gone upstairs and most of the people had stopped moving downstairs. He could still see the light bulb in the kitchen, and there wasn't really any disconnect between that hallway and the kitchen. So it's unlikely that the fire started back in that area, because it should have spread into the kitchen faster than it did in the Melody Lounge. But we can eliminate that area of origin. It is at ceiling level in the Melody Lounge, somewhere around that palm tree in the corner. The real debate is what the actual cause of this fire was. Throughout the years, there have been two competing theories for this fire. The first is the fire was caused when Stanley Tomaszewski held the match too close to the palm fronds and it ignited from there. That was what was the cause for years until the early mid 1990s. That was the main cause that everyone believed was the fire. The second potential cause is slightly more complicated. It's basically that an electrical failure ignited methyl chloride leaking from compressors on the other side of the wall of the Melody Lounge. And then I have a third theory that I will talk about in a minute. Now, methyl chloride has not come up at all in this episode whatsoever. And there's a reason for that. That's because those doing the investigation didn't know anything about it. So during World War II, there was a shortage of Freon for air conditioners. Freon is what is used to help cool air conditioners. There was a shortage of it because it was being used for other things. Civilians had to make do with what they had, which in this case, in the Cocoanut Grove, was methyl chloride. Now we know that Cocoanut Grove used methyl chloride was because there was research being done into the fire years later, and one of the people that supplied the methyl chloride to the Cocoanut Grove said, hey, they use methyl chloride in the air conditioners in the club there, and I know it because I'm the one that gave it to them. Now, a couple of things about methyl chloride. I've said it about 1 million times at this point. Number one, it is heavier than air. So, similar to propane, it sinks and it pools along the ground. Number two, it is flammable and burns with a blue flame. Just remember those two things as we get into the potential causes here and I break them down even more. So we're going to start with the match igniting the palm tree theory. It's fine in general, but it kind of falls apart in closer scrutiny. The first issue here is how quickly this fire is said to have spread. So let's just assume that Stanley held the match too close to one of the palm fronds. It ignites and starts burning. By the time he climbed down from the chair and turned around, the entire top of the tree and onto the ceiling were burning, according to multiple witnesses. and it flashed on from there. That is incredibly fast for that fire to have spread. It's also reported that there were several inches between the bulb and the coconut and the palm fronds in question. This would require him sticking the match almost in direct contact with one of the fronds higher than the thing he was looking at, which was the light bulb. Again, possible, but seems unlikely. So if you think about this, he is this coconut that has the light bulb in it is kind of angled downwards, and he's trying to find it. So he's likely not sticking this match all the way up past the coconut. He can probably see a little bit, so he can get a general idea, but he can't really tell. So to get a better idea, he lights it and he sticks it up there and can see it. Likely because it's unlikely that he lit the match and then stuck it up there without actually looking. That doesn't make much sense. It's possible, but it doesn't make much sense. So he likely stuck it up there and looked as he held the match up, found the light bulb, held it there for a moment while he screwed it in with his other hand, and then put it out. Many witnesses say that it was anywhere from 8 inches to a foot and a half to the palm fronds from where the actual coconut was. So he had to extend his arm significantly farther up into the palm fronds to actually get them ignited. And then that doesn't explain why they would have burned so quickly in such a short period of time, because it still has to get everything else to its ignition temperature. It doesn't really, you're not going to speed up that fast. Once the fire is actually going, then yeah, but how long does it take to climb down from a chair? A couple seconds? You're not going to go from complete match in a very small area to a complete tree on fire in that very small amount of time. So I don't feel like this is the actual cause of the fire. Now, I can't say with 100% certainty because weird things do happen on occasion, but it feels like him sticking the match up against the actual palm frond and igniting it that way wasn't really the cause here. So our next option is an electrical failure igniting available methyl chloride in the area. The biggest issue I have with this is that it would have to happen at the exact time, or very close to the exact time, Stanley stuck his match up there to see the light bulb. I think that is an astronomical coincidence. Like, technically it could happen, yes, but the sheer amount of things that would have to happen at the same time. You'd have to have the failure. It would have to already be burning. It would have had to continue to burn. He would have had to have missed it, because if it was the light bulb that failed, he would have had to have missed the fire as he was looking up there, because if there's a fire burning up in this palm frond already, there's no reason to light a match to be able to see it, because you're already going to get the glow. It's going to be weird. You'll be like, what is that? It's not the light bulb. Something is on fire. So the other option is that it's in the other room behind the wall at the compressors, and we've already ruled that out because we don't have any flames or smoke in that area when they make their exit. They would have noticed that, but they don't have anything because there's still light in there from light bulbs, and that's going to be one of the first things to dim. So it would have had to have been on the backside, and it would have had to have been a failure that just so happened to break out at the exact moment he stuck a match up there and was looking for this light bulb. And that feels like a huge, huge, huge stretch. So I think we can pretty conclusively rule that one out. And then there is the cause that feels the most accurate and most likely to me. That is that there was a layer of methyl chloride sitting in the void space up in the ceiling, between the ceiling and the cloth hanging down. So when Stanley stuck his match up there to be able to see the light bulb, he accidentally ignited the methyl chloride and it spread up into the ceiling. Now remember, methyl chloride is heavier than air, so it should have been pooled on the ground, and that is one of the big detractors of the electrical failure, is that there's no real reason why the methyl chloride should be up there, except if you think about the fact that that cloth likely would have held some of the methyl chloride up there, and it could have created a space where there was enough methyl chloride trapped in order for it to reach its ignition point, its ignition mixture in the air, that's lower explosive limit. Now, if you look at the pictures of Melody Lounge post-fire, there appears to be at least one pipe chase that goes in the general vicinity of where this particular there's a heater that hangs down in that corner, and it goes into the other room. So if that methyl chloride traveled through that hole in the wall and was sitting in a pool in that cloth area, and it was maybe falling down in that back corner where maybe some of the cloth had fallen down, so the gas was rolling off the edge, and he just happened to stick his match up there and get a little bit of a flash, and it went up into the ceiling without him realizing it, that would ignite the palm fronds in several areas as well as the ceiling. And then once it got into that void space, once the fire got into that void space, it would quickly flash across, because methyl chloride is flammable, and it would likely be at its lower, maybe at its lower explosive limit, possibly its upper explosive limit, because there's a lot of fire left over. So it's probably closer to upper explosive limit, and it didn't really have the containment it needed to actually cause an explosion. It just allowed the flame front to travel quickly and ignite things as it went, because there was a bunch of leftover fuel to burn. So the reason this isn't an actual explosion is because you don't really have the confinement you need to get that buildup of explosive pressure to rip everything apart. You just have a cloth ceiling that's gonna fall off pretty quickly and burn once it travels through fast enough, right? So if you have this one corner, back in the corner where this guy's taking this bulb out, poor Stanley climbs up there. He sticks his match up there. He's at the same time he's twisting the bulb, the light comes on. It blinds him a little bit because he's staring at it, because I don't know about you guys, but for some reason, whenever I screw in light bulbs, I'm staring at it, even though I know it's going to turn on and blind me. And there's a flash, and he thinks that flash is the bulb turning on, but it was actually that methyl chloride falling from the ceiling, igniting, and going up into the palmed fronds, which, conveniently, witness Jeanette Lenzoni worked in the basement, and she saw a flash up in the corner as Stanley was screwing in the light bulb. She said it wasn't like a normal flash of a fire. It wasn't like a flickering. It was he went up there, he turned a light on, and there was a flash in addition to the actual light bulb. And then it was a blue flame briefly. Now, methyl chloride burns blue, and there were many reports in the aftermath of the fire that some of the fire was actually blue, and they thought that was weird. And it is weird. If we have Stanley sticking this match too far up into the palm fronds, we should not have blue flames. It should be orange, maybe a little bit blue at the very base, but it should be primarily orange. The fact that there was enough blue flames for multiple people to notice it, multiple people to recognize, hey, that's weird, why is the flames blue, indicates that something else was going on here. What exactly that is, we're probably never going to know at this point. Most of the people that were involved in this fire have long been dead. It was 82 years ago. So even the youngest people there, Stanley, would be 98 at this point. So I think that I'm pretty comfortable with saying that it was likely that there was some methyl chloride sitting up there in that void space and had fallen down, and he managed to ignite a little bit of it, just enough to get it up into that space, and it had just hit that lower explosive limit or upper explosive limit enough that it was able to flash through the ceiling, catch the fabric on fire, and spread rapidly. That explains everything to do with this fire. Why we had the rapid expansion, why we had the blue flames, why the match didn't seem to go all the way up into the palm fronds, why no one could seem to get it out, because it had already spread well beyond what they were capable of seeing and or knowing, because it was up in the void space above them. It really fits with the entire explanation of this fire, that it They were behind from the very beginning. There was no chance they were going to get this out, especially with Ronald Sousa being in the club and having said he's seen them on fire multiple times before, and everyone has always gotten it out. There were multiple people that saw the top of the tree on fire. They even pulled it down, and they still couldn't get it out. That means that it was already burning up there in that void space. It was already burning the cloth, and it was already well beyond anything that they can control or they could deal with at the time. Now, obviously, technically, this fire is going to remain an undetermined cause because the Coconut Grove no longer exists, and we only have a handful of photos showing that corner, and honestly, they're not great photos. They're black and white. They're from 1942, man. But I really do think that while Stanley sticking the match up there technically caused the fire, it was well beyond his control, and he definitely didn't do anything wrong in this situation. He wasn't even supposed to be there. And honestly, in the end, the cause of this fire doesn't really matter. This was yet another example of common sense fire safety rules being ignored in order to make some extra money. In the aftermath of this fire, Massachusetts straight up banned revolving doors for a while. They were illegal everywhere in the state. Eventually, they changed that to make it so that there had to be swinging man doors on either side of the revolving door, and that the revolving doors must collapse in on itself in the event of an emergency. The mayor also ordered all nightclubs and bars closed for a bit after the fire, and all of them had their occupancy changed, so they were required more stringent fire safety rules. Outward swinging doors, mandated fire sprinklers, more exits that were not locked, exits marked with independently powered exit signs that could be clearly visible even in smoking conditions. They also required to have a certain amount of fire extinguishers, more than the 0 that were in Coconut Grove. Exits from establishments had to have a certain width to allow for easy exit, and a whole host of other things that changed in the aftermath of this fire. Also, in an interesting twist, the Boston Licensing Board banned the name the Coconut Grove from ever being used by another business in Boston ever, and that is still in effect. There can never be a establishment in the city of Boston named the Coconut Grove. The actual Coconut Grove nightclub was torn down not long after the fire, and the current location of where it sat has been built over several times. It is currently the site of the Revere Hotel and several condominiums. The only two things in the area that give any indication of the horrors that occurred there is what is left of Shawmut Street is now named Coconut Grove Lane, and a plaque in the ground on the corner of Piedmont Street and Coconut Grove Lane indicates a memorial of where 492 people died in one of the worst fires in American history. In November of 2023, a memorial was started in Boston's Statler Park that will contain 490 granite bricks with a victim's name inscribed on each. Now, why it's 490 and not 492, I do not know. But they at least will have a more permanent memorial in honor of the people who died in this absolutely terrible nightclub fire that absolutely should have been avoided and could have been avoided if anyone had followed any fire safety recommendations that were already in effect. This wasn't a fire of, oh, we didn't know. We didn't have any idea that this could happen. We absolutely did know this could happen. The building was inspected by a fire inspector a week before the fire. They knew they needed fire extinguishers. They knew they needed exits. The fire inspector did a poor job. He technically did his job, but he did a poor job. The owner of the club was more worried about making money, was more worried about people sneaking out without paying their tab. He wanted to pay people for cheap, so he hired a busboy who was underage. He was not the only busboy that was underage, but he was underage. He locked exits. He didn't do what needed to be done to make sure that his club was as safe as possibly could be. And he used connections that he had to make sure that he didn't have to pay for things that he didn't feel like he needed to pay for, like a liquor license or food handler's permits or anything like that. Basically, this one could have been avoided. We have all of the knowledge. We had all of the knowledge at the time. This didn't have to happen. This could have just been a fun night out for people. Oh, and there were 1,000 people in this club. The occupancy is 400. More people died in this fire than were allowed in the club in general. That is wild. We also knew that. We know that there was an occupancy limit because we had put an occupancy limit on it. We knew what could happen if things didn't have a maximum number of people. We knew that people would die in disasters, and they did it anyway, and they ignored it. And 492 people lost their lives because of it. And many people were injured for the rest of their lives, had burns all over their bodies that never quite fully healed because someone decided that he wanted to make more money than take care of the people in his establishment. And with that, we've reached the end of this week's episode. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I am so glad to be able to put out an episode again, and I'm so excited to be back. I love making episodes. I know I've been very, very, very absent lately. Life has been crazy, but I'm in a bit more of a stable place now, and I am working hard to get more episodes out and continue to bring you guys content that I enjoy sharing and you guys enjoy listening to. This show would be nothing without you all, and I'm so happy that you are here and are still here listening to this. Just so you're aware, my podcast episodes now have ads before and after. They are easily skippable. They're before and after, so if you don't listen to the end of it, you won't hear the ad, and you can skip the one at the beginning. If you do not want to put forth the effort to skip, you can join my Patreon for $1, and those are the ad-free episodes. They're the same as the normal episodes, just without an ad. So, as always, I thank you all so much. Oh, my Patreon is patreon.com/disastroushistory. It's just the name of the podcast. So, I appreciate you all so much. As always, stay safe, and remember to check your smoke detector batteries.